We're looking forward to talking with you today about hydrologic disconnect. But before we go too much further, I think the next slide gives a few tips for just as a reminder that if you're wanting to speak, if you have a question or a comment, please just indicate in the chat room. We'll keep track of that and call on you accordingly. That seems to have worked out the best for these meetings. And so we encourage any and all to feel free to speak up and just let us know again in the chat room. And otherwise, please keep your microphones on mute. So as part of the welcome today, Cheryl and I wanted to give a quick reminder of where we are in the process. So next slide, please. So we are in what we're calling the solutions phase, where we're working to develop ideas on how to address issues that had been identified by the post-2025 committee. And we've been focusing for the last 4 months on 3 particular issues. First, we discussed back in June about the groundwater and the assured water supply program. Last month, we talked about unreplenished groundwater withdrawals, and today we're going to be talking about hydrologic disconnect. As we did in the last couple of meetings, we have turned to ADWR to provide us additional data and information about these issues. And after having the presentation from DWR, we've had productive discussions where ideas have been suggested, and we have been keeping track of all of those thoughts that have been suggested. Today, we're going to, as I mentioned, talk about hydrologic disconnect, and actually we have 3 presentations today. We're going to be looking at hydrologic disconnect from 3 perspectives, from the annual storage and recovery, from long-term storage credits, and also from the pumping and replenishment perspectives. And so we're looking forward to having those presentations, and more importantly, afterwards, we are hoping to have a good conversation, generate some ideas, and look at how hydrologic disconnect can be addressed so that it is not a problem after going beyond 2025 and beyond, that we make sure that we're being preventive and avoiding creating problems. Cheryl and I will be then reporting next week to the Governor's Water Council about the committee and what we have been doing in the last 3 months. And then next slide, please. And then from October through December, we plan to work with all of you to fine-tune the most realistic and the strategies and solutions that have the most support here in the committee. So following this meeting and before our next one, Cheryl and I will be going through refining the list of ideas that were given and see if we can start fine-tuning to determine which ones are the most realistic to then be able to present at the December Governor's Water Council meeting those proposals that have general consensus for that. We know this is a very tight time frame. We know there's plenty of issues going on right now in the water world. And so we're doing our best we will do our best to see what we can come up with. And we know that we still have next year that provides us an opportunity to have continued discussion to develop additional strategies and solutions. So let's go to the next slide. So let's go ahead and jump right into the focus of today's meeting on hydrologic disconnect, and I will gladly turn this over to Jenna Norris to start us off.
Thank you, Warren. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jenna Norris, as Warren just shared, and I coordinate the Governor's Water Council. Today, I will be presenting on the hydrologic disconnect, starting with a broad introduction and overview of the topic, and then sharing a dashboard that helps visualize the total amount of water delivered to all facilities, and then breaks down the trends and types of recovery, cut to aquifer, and physical losses. And then I'll end with some maps that spatially visualize what is being shared in that dashboard, as well as locations of currently permitted recovery wells. So with that, next slide. Thank you. So starting off with the broad overview of the concept of recharge and recovery, what you're reading on your screen, I actually pulled from the issue brief. I thought it summarized this nicely. So the activity of storing qualified water supplies underground in a permitted facility is referred to as recharge. Excess water supplies can either be sent to an underground storage facility, commonly called a USF, or a groundwater savings facility called a GSF, and then those stored supplies become accessible later through what is called recovery. When stored water is recovered within the same calendar year, that is called annual storage and recovery. And when stored water is left in storage for a time period greater than a year, that activity generates what is called a long-term storage credit, and that long-term storage credit can be recovered in future years. Next slide. So what is the hydrologic disconnect in the context of recharge and recovery, or pumping and replenishment? Again, the issue brief defines the hydrologic disconnect as the ability to legally recover or replenish water that was respectively stored or pumped in a different location. And from that, I kind of asked the question of what constitutes different. And the hydrologic disconnect has often been discussed in relation to recharge and recovery, as well as replenishment and pumping occurring in different hydrologic subbasins. But beyond that, when thinking about it in terms of permitting and maintaining the ability to recover stored water pursuant to 83401, which is the statute that governs recovery, a person who holds long-term storage credits or who stores water on an annual basis can recover that water stored if the well is permitted for recovery, and then if the well is located within the area of impact of the stored water, or if the well is located outside of the impact of the stored water and certain additional criteria are met. So then I think that opens the question of what is the area of impact. Next slide. So the department has interpreted the area of impact for an underground storage facility to be the area contained within the 1 mile buffer of the facility, also referred to as the 1 mile safe harbor, or the area of hydrologic impact. And for a GSF, this is the area contained within the exterior boundary of that GSF. Next slide. So recovery, as long as the water to be recovered was stored within the same AMA, that water can be recovered from anywhere within the AMA. However, recovery outside the area of impact of the stored water does have to meet additional management plan recovery siting criteria. That criteria contains 3 requirements. 2 of those requirements are on your screen right now. The first being that at the time of application, the maximum projected depth of water at the location of recovery cannot exceed over 100 years the general depth to static water level for that area, specified by Rule 1215 or Rule 15.716, and that's referencing those assured water supply depths. So 1,000 feet for Phoenix, Prescott, and Tucson AMAs, and 1,200 feet for Pinal. And then the second requirement is that the recovery well is in an area experiencing average annual rate of groundwater decline that is less than 4 feet per year. And do note that that's not at the time of application, so it's interpreted that that must be maintained across essentially the life of the permit of that recovery well. Next slide. So here I've listed out some differences between annual and long-term storage credit recovery. This is by no means a comprehensive list. It just calls out some things that I thought might be important to keep in mind as we continue in this discussion today. So decreed and appropriative, also referred to as D&N, surface water supplies in Phoenix, that's mostly Salt and Verde River water, must be stored and recovered within the same month. So that means that all surface water storage and recovery is accounted for as annual storage and recovery. And then beyond that, annual storage and recovery is not subject to a cut to the aquifer, with just one exception to that for effluent in a managed facility, I believe. And contrary to annual storage and recovery, long-term storage credits are subject to a cut to the aquifer. That amount is typically 5%, again with some exceptions, and that cut to the aquifer is intended to provide a general benefit to the aquifer from that recharge activity. Next slide. So now that we've laid out kind of a foundational understanding of how all of these components interact, I thought it would be interesting to share some figures that really get at the scale of storage and recovery for all of the AMAs. These numbers are cumulative, pulled from the years 1989, which marks the onset of the program, to 2017. That first figure shows the annual recovery for all AMAs has been approximately 2,700,000 acre feet. Long-term storage credits recovered has been about 450,000 acre feet to date. So what this means is that roughly 85% of all recovery has been annual storage and recovery up until this point. And then moving down, wet water delivered is around 15 million acre feet. For all, again, this is for all of the AMAs since the onset of the program. And the available long-term storage credits for recovery are around 11,500,000 acre feet. So that means that roughly 20% of the water delivered has been recovered thus far. Keep in mind that 20% is does not account for physical losses, but it gives you a good idea of just how much water has been delivered versus how much has been recovered. So on that note, and kind of keeping in with that train of thought, next slide, I'm going to have, John pass me over the presenter role so that I can share my screen. So, and I'm going to share with you all a dashboard. A dashboard that breaks down this a little bit further, as well as some maps, like I said. Okay, looks like it's presenting okay. Great. Okay, so what I have here on the screen is a dashboard that is showing the amount of water delivered for all AMAs, and then what is below, that's purple and above the zero axis, and it's for each year, so it's not cumulative. And then if you move below the zero axis, it shows the annual recovery in a given year, the cut to the aquifer, the physical losses is in orange, and in dark purple are the long-term storage credits recovered. And I'm going to pause for a moment because I do want to note that this dashboard is published on our website. Thank you. Natalie just put it in the chat. For really the rest of my presentation, a lot of this material is pretty interactive and is something that I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on, but I just want to share the kind of overarching picture. So please feel free to open it up as I'm talking and kind of click around, and you'll see there's various filters here and whatnot. And so anyways, with that being said, I'll go back to this dashboard. So you've got your deliveries, and above the zero axis, you can kind of think about those as being all the positive numbers, and then your recovery and physical losses and cut to the aquifer below. So think of those as being your negative numbers. And when you sum up your positive numbers and subtract your negative number, you're left with this yellow line. And in practice, what that really ends up displaying is the amount of recoverable credits that are earned in a given year. So again, this is what we're looking at right now is for all AMAs. So for example, in 2011, 609,000 roughly credits were earned. So the other thing that this dashboard and yellow line represents is that for much of the history of the recharge and recovery program, this line has been trending in the positive direction, which is indicating that there's been more deliveries occurring than recovery, physical losses, and cut to the aquifer combined. What we expect to see as we get deeper into shortages and a lot of those credits become relied upon and utilized more is that this line will start to trend in the negative direction and get closer and closer to the zero axis. Your purple bar graph on the top will get smaller and smaller if less water is delivered, and as more water is recovered, what is below the zero axis will get larger and larger. And so I think I'm going to click through some of these. I'm going to start with Phoenix and surface water because I think it does a great job of depicting kind of what I just described and cementing that concept I shared earlier, that for surface water, all surface water supplies that are not CAP, so decreed and appropriative, surface water has to be stored and recovered in the same year. So you'll see that this zero line, the yellow line is going to stay consistent along that zero axis, showing that in a given year, what is delivered has to be recovered. You can move through. Again, I encourage you to click through and look at all of the different ways you can kind of view this data and visualize. So here's all the AMAs. And what you'll see as we go through these is that pretty consistently, all of the AMAs have that zero line being far above the zero axis, as in that far more water is being delivered than is being recovered, which I shared in that 20% figure in the last slide. So when we're talking about this in the context of hydrologic disconnect, this I think does a good job of exemplifying how much future impacts from hydrologic disconnect could happen. Of course, what we're looking at right now is not spatial, so that doesn't mean that all recovery and as this line trends down will be hydrologically disconnected or that pumping and replenishment will be, but it does show that any impacts we are currently seeing from hydrologic disconnect are really only a fraction of what could potentially occur. So with that being said, I am going to move on to some maps. Okay, let's see. I want to make this full screen, but it might be, well, that's okay. We'll leave it like this. So again, these maps are all posted on our website. I think it's, if you're interested, it's helpful to kind of pull them up and you can follow along as I explain. Same thing as the dashboard. I'm not going to go into extensive detail, but I do hope they kind of give everybody a good framework to work on for the rest of, to work off of for the rest of this discussion about the current state of where a lot of the water has been delivered and where recovery wells are permitted in relation to that. So just going through this legend, the gray kind of organic shapes are representing the area of impact of USF, or that 1 mile safe harbor. I think that and then these little, I'm going to zoom in, everybody. Those little gray triangles are representing the locations of recovery wells. So I think that by having this safe harbor layer on, you're able to see not only which wells are located within the safe harbor or 1 mile area of impact of a USF, but it kind of helps give some spatial reference as to how far away things are. So moving back to the legend, this map also shows graduated symbols based on the amount of delivered volume to a given USF or GSF. For USFs, the small blue squares have the lowest amount of water delivered over time. The medium-sized pink-purple squares have greater than 115,000 acre feet up to 500,000 acre feet. And this, of course, now I see that there's one extra zero here. No matter how many times you look and look and look at something, that always happens, right? I think everybody can relate to that. So forgive me for that. That is 115,000 to 500,000. And then moving to that large green square is 500,000 to up to 1,200,000 acre feet. Again, this is amount of just wet water delivered to these facilities. The same scale applies for the GSFs. You've got your blue hatching, your purple hatching, and your green hatching, though. So, for example, this is Tonopah Irrigation District, I believe, that I'm circling with my mouse, and that is received an amount of water that is between 115,000 to 500,000 acre feet. So, as we look at this, I think that everybody is pretty well aware that Hassayampa has been kind of the subject or the example for a lot of discussions around hydrologic disconnect, because you can see that there's been a lot of water delivered here. Tonopah has received a lot of wet water over the years. There's this managed facility. I believe this is another USF, maybe an ASR well. And then conversely, you don't really have a lot of recovery wells out here. So this water is going to be recovered somewhere. Currently, there's not a lot of permitted recovery wells in Hassayampa, so then it's safe to say that it likely will not be recovered within Hassayampa. Moving over to the right, you have the exact same view or extent of Hassayampa subbasin, but this time with a depth to water table raster layer. This is a layer that was created to just show an approximation of depth to water below land surface for 2018. It's kind of an approximation snapshot in time. On this map, you also have a groundwater level change series that I pulled from Field Services, ADWR, who produced these. And so what this represents is in 2013, a water level measurement was taken at a given, let's say at this blue point. In 2013, a water level measurement was taken, and then that same point had a water level measurement taken in 2018, and they found that that water level had increased at that spot. And so blue dots represent areas that are experiencing a positive change, and red dots represent areas that are experiencing negative changes, and the size of the dots represent the scale of just how much that is changing. So you'll see here that there are some shallow depth to water, and in Hassayampa, it's kind of a mixed bag. You have some blue and you've got some red. And so now that we've kind of talked through what these maps are showing, I'm going to move on to West Salt River Valley Subbasin. So here you see, I think the first thing that's pretty notable is there's a lot more recovery wells, a lot more little gray triangles. I think we all know that that makes sense because this is where the cities are located. A lot of those recovery wells are also going to be permitted for production and likely serving service area rights. And so as you see, there are a fair share of wells located within SRP's GSF, and that is also the facility that has received the largest amount of water over time for West Salt River Valley Subbasin. And moving over to the right, you'll see the water level change map and the depth to water table. So this area of shallow groundwater is representing the Gila River corridor, and you're also seeing that though it has shallow depths of groundwater, it is experiencing some decline in or a negative rate of change. Again, I do encourage you kind of, they're pretty high resolution, so you can zoom in and look around and kind of see where things are located. I'm going to now move to the East Salt River Valley subbasins. So let me zoom in a little bit. What you're seeing here is the rest of SRP's GSF, as well as this is Roosevelt Irrigation District, I believe. There's been a lot of water stored in the East Salt River Valley subbasin. This USF is grust, and you'll see that there are a lot of wells congregated around grust and again in the GSF. There are also this little pocket of wells as you move over to Apache Junction that they're not very close to any recharge, and if they are close to recharge, it's not a substantial amount. You've got two little recharge facilities here. They haven't received a lot of water over the past 28 years. And as you move to the right, you'll see that those wells are also located in the area experiencing a little bit deeper depth to groundwater, and that additionally you're seeing some negative rates of change in the groundwater levels in that area. So there's a similar kind of example as you move up and north. You've got a lot of wells congregated here. I do believe that Scottsdale Water Campus has some water delivered up here, but I think that these are just, what I hope this map does is just kind of help guide the conversation and the solutions that they consider the hydrologic conditions as well. So moving on to Tucson. I think most people are pretty familiar with the kind of classic story of hydrologic disconnect as it relates to the two subbasins in Tucson. So, and I know that that was also shared in the issue brief. I'm going to take a sip of water. So what you are seeing here is a lot of wells and some recharge facilities, not a lot, and there's not any recharge facilities that have that green symbolization, which indicates there's not any facilities that have had greater than 500,000 acre feet of water delivered over the past 28 years. And the story with Santa Cruz, Upper Santa Cruz Subbasin, and Tucson Recharge and Recovery and Hydrologic Disconnect in general is that Tucson Water Company has a well field in Upper Santa Cruz Basin to serve their customers, and as you can see, most of the recharge has been happening in Avra Valley, which I'm now going to go to. And so a lot of the pumping was occurring in Upper Santa Cruz, which we just looked at, and a lot of the recharge was occurring in Avra Valley, and so that kind of is that quintessential example of hydrologic disconnect. So they were seeing declining depth to groundwater and declining groundwater levels in Upper Santa Cruz from that pumping, and the recharge that maybe would have been helping to offset that was all happening in a separate subbasin and was hydrologically disconnected. So they have improved upon those conditions greatly by, I think, through partnerships, and you can see here that, I'm going to zoom in. These two facilities right here are very well known. They're called CAVSARP and SAVSARP for short, and they have received a lot of water over the course of the past 28 years. They both have those green squares. And the other interesting thing you can see is that all of the wells the vast majority of the wells are all located within the area of impact, or within really the 1 mile safe harbor of those facilities. And as you move to the right and tie that together with depth to water table, you'll see that though there's a lot of recovery, and we looked at the dashboard, so to kind of tie it all together, we looked and we saw that Tucson does a lot of annual recovery in a given year, and a lot of that annual recovery is reported as occurring, that water that's being recovered is stored at these two facilities oftentimes. And the wells that are pumping that recovered water are often these wells that are within the area of impact of these facilities, and you can see reflected on the map that the depth to groundwater in those areas is relatively shallow still, despite the pumping. And so I think that, this is an example that has been touted, but it is interesting to look at it spatially and see it on a map. And so that really concludes, goodness, sorry to give everybody a headache there. That concludes my presentation, and I look forward to hearing from Krista Mcjunkin of SRP on her presentation on this topic. And if you have any questions, I do believe we're going to share back the slide. You can go to the next slide. Thank you, Catherine. If you have any questions now, I would be happy to take them. And that is all. Thank you so much for listening and participating.
So I guess I'll just jump in. My name is Krista Mcjunkin. I'm Director of Water Strategy for Salt River Project. And I'm going to be presenting today on specifically the Phoenix Active Management Area and looking at the issue of hydrologic disconnect, really focusing in on long-term storage credits that are planned to be recovered in the future. So if you could move to the next slide. So SRP has been interested in this issue for a while, given that we operate 2 underground storage facilities as well as a large groundwater savings facility. And we also are involved and plan to be involved in the future in the recovery of those credits. So this is an important issue for us. After the issue paper came out in the spring, we were particularly interested in trying to get a sense of the scale of this problem so that we have a better idea of what potential solutions could be out there to address it. So when we think about hydrologic disconnect, I think it's helpful to think about it as broken down into these 3 elements. And as Jenna so ably covered in the previous presentation, one of those is annual storage and recovery. Later, you'll hear from the GRD about long-term storage credits that are used for replenishment. But it's this 3rd area, if you'll move to the next slide, that I'll be focusing on, which is long-term storage credits that have been stored for future recovery. And so if you'll move to the next slide, I'll go over our kind of objectives and how we went about this work. So we looked at, with the help of a data request from the Department of Water Resources, long-term storage credit locations within the active management area. And then we wanted to determine the geographic extent of the hydrologic disconnect between where the water was stored and its probable location of recovery. And then after getting our handle on what the extent of the issue was, we also put our minds to thinking of what some potential solutions might look like for those credits that are disconnected. If you could move on. So how we went about this is we obtained data from the Department of Water Resources with the most recent long-term storage credit balances for all long-term storage credits held in the Phoenix AMA. And that included balances accumulated through the end of 2019. The data included where the facilities, where the credits were stored, and the water type. However, we did not distinguish between different water types, and all of the credits were summed up by location, not with regard to the type of water that was being stored. You can move on. So our data shows that the credit held for future recovery kind of break down into three broad categories. There's a total of over 6.2 million long-term storage credits, acre feet of long-term storage credits that are in storage that will be used for future recovery. The bulk of them are held in the names of municipal providers, approaching 3 million acre feet in that category. The water bank has another 2 million or almost 2 million acre feet in storage. And then there's a collection of about 50, I think it's 56 or 57 entities that make up this other category that I'll go over briefly as well, that hold the remainder of the credits in the Phoenix AMA. Now our efforts, if you'll move to the next slide, were really to focus in on the credits that we had the ability to make a good judgment as to where they would likely be recovered from. And so that led us to really focusing in on the credits held by municipal providers. And so the way that we approached this was to say that long-term storage credits held by municipal providers were likely to be, they need to be recovered by that entity's wells within their service area. So we looked at the credits that each water provider had with regard to credits located within their service area, credits that are outside of their service area but still within the same subbasin. We thought that was an important distinction to make. In previous discussions about enhanced aquifer management, there has been a recognition that at least having water within the same subbasin is beneficial. So we thought that was an important distinction to draw out. And then the third category we looked at were credits that are outside of the same subbasin. And so by identifying where the credits were located with regard to individual water providers' service areas, that gave us the ability to demonstrate the extent of the hydrologic disconnect. You can move on to the next slide. And so here's what we found. When you look at the 2.82 million acre feet of long-term storage credits held by municipal providers, over 78% of those credits are located inside of their own service areas. So that means that their credits are located in a place that they either already have wells or they have the ability to drill wells to recover that water from where it was stored. We thought this was a significant finding, and that really gave us a lot of comfort that perhaps when it comes to existing long-term storage credits for future recovery by municipal providers, the extent of the potential for the hydrologic disconnect problem wasn't as bad as we had feared. So we were very comforted by this result. We also found that there was, of the credits that are outside of a municipal provider's service area, that 13% of them were at least within the same subbasin. Now, subbasins can be quite large, so that may not be sufficient, but it at least gives you an idea of the kind of vicinity that they are in. And then we have, there's then 9% left that are both outside of the service area and outside of the same subbasin. So some of these are located at quite some distance and don't have any hydrologic connection between where they were stored and where they're likely to be recovered. So those, that 13% and that 9% were really the areas of credits that we wanted to focus in on for solutions. And I'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. But I also, we did spend some time thinking about those other categories of credits besides just the credits held by municipal water providers. So if you'll move to the next slide. So the water bank obviously holds a great deal of credits in the Phoenix AMA, but the plans for recovery, while there are lots of potential plans for recovery, the specific arrangements are still in the works. So it wasn't possible for us to make a clear determination as to which credits would be recovered outside the area of impact because the location of future recovery isn't finalized. So instead, in fact, somewhat similarly to the approach that Jenna took, we thought it would be helpful to just show on a map the location where the water bank has credits stored. So you can see that the credits that they have stored at underground facilities are indicated by the red dots, the size relating to the volume stored at that facility. And then the hatched areas showing the groundwater savings facility credits. And the color of the hatching reflects the amount of credits stored at each facility. And then we overlaid that with the service areas of the water providers who are CAP subcontractors, who would be the future beneficiaries of water bank credits and the recovery of those credits. And what we hope that this map helps identify are opportunities for partnerships. A lot of these opportunities are not new information. I'm sure the water bank and the cities are already working together to figure out these opportunities, but just for the purposes of our discussion today, we thought this was a helpful tool. But I think it also points up the need for consideration of credits that are located at a far distance, and recognizing that those credits, such as credits at the Tonopah Desert facility, require a special approach because there isn't an overlapping service area that could be an obvious recovery partner. And I know that CAP is already pursuing that matter, and research is ongoing as to coming up with recovery plans for that facility. You can move on to the next slide. And so that leaves us with these other entities. And so there's about 1.4 million acre feet of long-term storage credits held by 57 non-municipal entities. It's about 23% of the credits that are stored in the Phoenix AMA for future recovery. And of that volume, 83% of it is held by these 6 entities. So the credits held by GROWS and GRIC, that's the Gila River Indian Community and the Gila River Water Storage partnership that we have with GRIC to store water for future use. Credits held by the TOs, by Resolution Copper, Freeport, and then credits held by SRP specifically for power generation purposes. And the reason that these credits are difficult to analyze with regard to the hydrologic disconnect issue is that the location of future recovery is not known or not finalized or not confirmed. So I can just say from a qualitative standpoint, the credits that are held by GROWS and GRIC are intended to be used, recovered from the area they are stored. That's something that's important to us in our partnership. So that's something that we have, I can just say qualitatively, all of our arrangements thus far have been based on that notion that we try to match up the location where we have stored credits with the arrangements for future purchases. I don't have any particular knowledge of where the TOs plan to recover their stored water. I know Resolution Copper definitely has plans for recovery, but saying specifically that all these credits would be recovered from the area of impact, I can't make any pronouncements to that. And similarly with Freeport. I can also say that with credits that SRP has, we do have a commitment to recover these credits from within the area they were stored, and we have wells to be able to do that. So this gives you a sense that part of the complexity of really getting your arms around the hydrologic disconnect issue is the fact that you have to know where the location of future recovery is in order to determine whether the credits are actually disconnected between recovery and storage location. We can move on to solutions. So I should preface these slides by saying these are completely figments of our imagination. We have not talked to any of the parties that are listed here. Some of them may have come up with these ideas on their own. If so, more power to them. But don't take this as any commitment by any party. We're trying to come up with options and examples that we could share that would illustrate how potential solutions could work. So the first one, and certainly the lowest cost option, is trading credits. As you look at the credits that are located outside of a water provider's service area, there are plenty of situations where an East Valley city has credits in the West Valley and vice versa. So our first approach will be to try and play matchmaker and look for opportunities where both parties equally benefit by relocating credits into a facility that's within their service area where their wells could recover the credits. So the options listed here, one is just a straight 2-party agreement between the city of Goodyear and the city of Peoria to exchange credits or trade credits between the Agua Fria constructed facility and the credits that Peoria has at the SRP GSF. And the reason that credits at the SRP GSF would be beneficial to a city like Goodyear is that our agreement, SRP has an agreement with Goodyear to wheel their CAP water through our system, and also to, they're able to lease our wells for recovery purposes. So credits stored within SRP facilities, like our groundwater savings facility, Goodyear has access to our wells to be able to recover those credits within the area they were stored. So that's a pretty straightforward trade. The option on the right is a little more complicated, a 3-party arrangement where Phoenix, Gilbert, and Queen Creek would each trade credits at various locations at the end end up with credits located at a facility where either their wells or wells they could lease could recover the credits. So that gives you an idea. There's many more options like this. And all in all, it's something like 67,000 acre feet of credits that are considered to be hydrologically disconnected could be relocated into a beneficial place through a trading arrangements like these. So you can move on to the next slide. Okay, so then the next option is identifying locations where the stored water is outside of where it needs to be to facilitate recovery by the entity that stored the water, but it's located in an area that is adjacent to the CAP canal and in an area that has existing wells, so that the cost of infrastructure is less. So these are examples that we've come up with. One would be the city of Goodyear recovering their new magma long-term storage credits through perhaps leasing wells from new magma and then putting that water in the CAP canal and then having it delivered to them through the CSIF with a wheeling agreement with CAP. So that gives you an idea of arrangements that could at least take advantage of some existing facilities or existing infrastructure in order to recover the water from where it was stored. And if you want to move on to the next slide. And then our final option is certainly the most expensive, and it's again not new information, but that these larger projects that will really take major investment and major collective action by a lot of parties would be arrangements like at Tonopah, where you don't have what you at least are adjacent to the CAP canal, but it's necessary to drill new wells and build new infrastructure in order to bring that water into the canal for wheeling purposes. So we hope that these solutions at least give folks an idea of kind of the scale of the investment necessary, but really just to spark conversation about ways that we can work together to ensure that water is recovered from hydrologically connected areas. And so if you want to move on to my next slide, I'll wrap up. So just to recap what I shared today, what we found, this is not new information, but really you can't determine the extent of hydrologic disconnect unless you know where the recovery is going to take place. And so with that in mind, it'll enabled us to just focus in on the credits held by municipal providers. And what we found was that 78% of them are located within their service areas where their wells can recover them. And of the credits that are located outside of their service area, only 9% of the total is outside of the same subbasin. And of the credits that are located outside of their service area, there are options. So like I said earlier, about 70,000 acre feet can be traded to a location inside of the service area just through party-to-party trades. And then there can be additional investments in infrastructure, either through using existing wells that are adjacent to the CAP canal, or there are projects that are much more investment intensive, such as the recovery that will be needed at Tonopah. But at least we hope that this kind of framing of the issue, first of all, gives some comfort that the amount of water that's dislocated is not as bad as previously feared, and that there are options for addressing the remaining credits that do need to be more hydrologically connected. And that's what I have for you today.
Thank you, Chris. We appreciate that. And we'll now go to Vivian for a presentation regarding CAGRD obligation and replenishment regarding hydrologic disconnect.
Thanks, Warren, and good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to present this work on CAGRD's obligation and replenishment activity in relationship to the hydrologic disconnect. I just want to thank my previous presenters. I think together we're kind of addressing all these different components of the hydrologic disconnect. So that's been really helpful for me. I also want to acknowledge and thank Jake Wilda, Dave Dunaway, and Chris Brooks for their help on this project in the GRD. So by now the committee has discussed the CAGRD at length several times. So I'll just keep the overview of the GRD brief and focus on how that relates to the hydrologic disconnect. Much of this work was covered in the April meeting of the CAGRD and Underground Storage Committee, But today I'll focus in with a closer look at some of the AMAs and sub-basin level data. So stay on that slide there. So just briefly, CAWCD's replenishment authorities and duties are fulfilled by the CAGRD, or the Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District, which is a separate department of CAWCD, but governed by the same entity, our board of directors. The state legislature enabled this through the Groundwater Replenishment District Act, which was enacted in 1993. Members may enroll in the CAGRD as member service area water providers or as individual member land subdivisions as part of the Certificate of Assured Water Supply process. Our members have diverse water portfolios from many sources, but ultimately some amount of excess groundwater beyond their permitted limit is pumped by them to serve their customers. GRD's responsibility is to replenish the reported excess pumped groundwater, which we call obligation, on behalf of its members. CAGRD is also an important part of groundwater management in the service area, which is the Phoenix, Pinal, and Tucson AMAs. By replenishing excess groundwater, the GRD ensures that these water providers are consistent with the Assured Water Supply program. By statute, CAGRD must replenish groundwater in an amount equal to the replenishment obligation of its members within 3 years and in the same AMA. You could go to the next slide. Statute later gets more specific for the Phoenix AMA and directs that CAGRD, to the extent feasible, shall replenish groundwater in the east and west portions of the Phoenix AMA in the approximate proportions of which obligation was incurred. The board of directors has also included direction in its strategic plans to direct the CAGRD to go above and beyond what statutes say. We are to responsibly meet CAP's statutory obligation and consider the hydrologic relationship between member pumping and replenishment. Next slide. So I don't need to go over all of this. DWR did a good job explaining the hydrologic disconnect. I went over the issue brief, but essentially it's a spatial separation from where water is stored and where it's removed, which is permitted at the AMA level for recharge and recovery, as well as pumping and subsequent replenishment. But there are also incentives from ADWR to limit the extent of this disconnected pumping. And we also have guidance from our own board, as I reviewed. So next slide. So here you can see the volume of excess groundwater pumping and replenishment that is happening at the AMA and sub-basin level during a single year, in this case 2018. Also included for context is the amount of annual storage or recovery, as well as recovery of long-term storage credits, which comprise the other components of hydrologic disconnect. The overall size of the pie charts helps you take a step back even further and see these sectors in relation to overall physical pumping at the AMA and sub-basin level. This other pumping category includes groundwater pumping from irrigation grandfather rights, type 1 and type 2 rights, and other activities. So what you find when you look at this is that ASR, long-term storage credit recovery, and excess groundwater pumping are currently a small portion of the overall physical pumping occurring in each AMA. And they're even less so when you consider that some of the recovery activity is occurring within the area of impact. This is particularly relevant in the Tucson AMA, where there's a lot of annual storage and recovery, but it's also primarily occurring within the AOI, as shown in the Tucson AMA subbasins. Also just want to note that some of the other pumping category is associated with waterlogged areas or other areas where water level declines are not occurring. And none of this is to diminish the importance of addressing the hydrologic disconnect, but some care should be exercised when looking at how much of an impact it has on groundwater levels and other management goals that we care about. So next slide. So like the other presenters, it's crucial to look at the spatial understanding of this issue. And so there's lots of maps in everybody's presentations, but just quickly, the AMAs cover a vast area of central and southern Arizona, and across them there are 1,200 plus member lands and 24 member service areas. So this map just shows the location of the member lands as well as recharge facilities where replenishment has occurred to date. So let's get into how these facilities are used in the next slide, please. So the first thing I just want to mention is that CAGRD has and will continue to meet all statutory requirements for our replenishment obligations. The map on the left shows total quantities of member pumping and replenishment and the replenishment reserve in the AMAs from 2001 to 2018, so it's a cumulative volume. The map on the right breaks this data down by subbasins, and overall obligation for this 18-year time period has been just over 550,000 acre feet. 540,000 of that was replenished by the end of 18, but more of that has been replenished since, as I mentioned, we have 3 years to do so. So we do have statute that directs us to balance replenishment on the east and west sides of the Phoenix AMA, so we can look at that first. There's been a significant amount of replenishment in the West Phoenix AMA area, which includes Hassayampa, Lake Pleasant, and the West Salt River Valley. So there's been replenishment in each of those, which you can see at the subbasin level. That includes replenishment at CAP operated facilities, GSFs, and the Liberty Aquifer USF. And that USF is interesting too and helpful in that it's the product of a unique partnership with Liberty Utilities, which is a member land water provider, and really replenishes within the vicinity of actual pumping. We hope that this can be a model for how CAGRD can work with other water providers to further regional water management goals. In the eastern part, obligation and replenishment have been more closely aligned, as you see there. Very little activity so far has happened in the Pinal AMA, although we do have a lot of enrolled member lands and member service areas as well, but not too much obligation at this point. In the Tucson AMA, most of the replenishment occurs in the Abra Valley, as we saw, where large-scale recharge facilities are storing water on behalf of many CAP customers and statewide entities. The Upper Santa Cruz is where the obligation is incurred. That's where most of the water providers are. But like I said, like it was mentioned, there's plenty of annual storage and recovery that's happening. So what's kind of missing from these maps is an acknowledgement of the infrastructure that links these two subbasins. There's actual pipes and other infrastructure, the Tucson Aqueduct that connects recharge in Abra Valley to the Tucson metro area. And also for the Tucson AMA, per the 2016 strategic plan, GRD staff have worked to balance replenishment and obligation between the north and south portions of the Tucson AMA. So with that, I just want to highlight the other long-term storage credits that are held by CAGRD and CWCD for the purpose of future replenishment. So if you could advance. So what I've added here in the table is the amount of credits that are in the replenishment reserve, which is a statutorily required mechanism for holding additional credits in reserve for future replenishment. We also have other credits held by CAGRD and CWCD in different long-term storage sub-accounts in each of the AMAs. And all of that is for satisfying future replenishment. So this shows a much more accurate view of our impact on the hydrologic disconnect. The replenishment reserve is more than 256,000 acre feet of credits, and our other sub-accounts include well over 1 million acre feet. With that in mind, and looking kind of at the balance with those additional numbers in there, the only subbasins that have a negative balance, so to speak, would be the Upper Santa Cruz and the Fountain Hills subbasin. So looking at those numbers a little bit more, There's a large balance of other credits available in the West and East Salt River Valley subbasins where most of the GRD's replenishment has been, which is important. And we know there's also a good portion of those credits in the Pinal AMA, where there has not been a lot of obligation so far. But this is due to the large volume of credits stored by CEWCD and dedicated by the board for future use for replenishment purposes, as well as the recent GRIC-ROSE deal. So I wanted to just take you a little bit closer in on the subbasin level. I'm going to go over the subbasins with the most CAGRD activity, which has historically been in the Phoenix and Tucson AMAs. So if you could go to the next slide. Okay, so what you're seeing now is a zoomed in look at the West Valley of the Phoenix AMA. I'm showing member lands and member service areas, as well as replenishment locations, which includes Hieroglyphic Mountains, Agua Fria, and the Liberty USFs that I mentioned earlier, and also the Maricopa Water District GSF. Member service area obligation tapered off in the early 2010s. You could see the kind of the annual accounting of obligation and replenishment to the right. And that would happen just as member land obligation rose and then stabilized somewhat. Overall, replenishment has been strong in the West Valley, with a lot of it occurring at Hieroglyphic and Agua Fria, and also the GSF. But there's also a lot of other held credits, which is in that the other credits column in the chart top right, which are mainly held at the Liberty Aquifer USF, which is right in the middle of where a lot of the obligation is occurring. So that's positive. You'd go to the next slide. So this is showing the southeastern part of the East Salt River Valley subbasin. Member lands and member service areas coincide with the replenishment locations such as the Superstition Mountain USF and 2 groundwater savings facilities, Queen Creek Irrigation District and New Magma Irrigation District. As you see in the annual obligation replenishment data, there's been more replenishment and additional credit storage in the last decade, which is a direct effect of building the Superstition Mountains facility to store CAP supplies. And we've also utilized the GSFs more in an attempt to, as I mentioned, by statute, make sure that we're balancing replenishment on the East and West Phoenix level. So next slide. So just to be complete, in the West Phoenix AMA, the other big use from the replenishment side is the Hassayampa subbasin. Deliveries have been made to the Tonopah Irrigation District and Tonopah Desert USF, also known as TDRP. What's also interesting is to note that there are enrolled member lands in this subbasin. They're mostly unbuilt so far, but they do represent future obligation in the subbasin. So we want to keep that in mind. So if we can move to the next slide, we'll go to the Tucson AMA. And so it's definitely more of a challenge to separate out obligation and replenishment by subbasin in the Tucson AMA. Most of the obligation occurs in the upper Santa Cruz, and the replenishment is in the Abra Valley, which you see here. Most of the water providers are member service areas in the Tucson AMA from the GRD's perspective. Replenishment has been accomplished both through CAGRD and CAP deliveries to recharge facilities, but also a lot of credits have been transferred to the GRD from these member service areas that store a lot of water on their own. But the USFs you see there are the Lower Santa Cruz managed and constructed USFs and the Abra Valley Recharge Project. Also, importantly, we've utilized many groundwater savings facilities, including BKW Farms, Kai Farms, and the Cortero Marana Irrigation District. So let's move on, please. So the obligation in the Upper Santa Cruz subbasin is from the member service areas, but there's also member lands, as you can see, in the upper and lower reaches of the subbasin. and that includes around Sahuarita and North Aurora Valley and the Saddlebrook community. MSA obligation, though, has declined a lot since the early 2000s, especially due to reduced reliance from the city of Tucson and others over time. I mean, to that effect, Metropolitan DWID has actually left the CAGRD in the time since I made this in April, so something to note. But really, in these instances, the CAGRD has served as a bridge to renewable supplies. In the case of MSAs, it's been an important supply as they've worked to increase the utilization of their CAP supplies directly or through partnerships with other water providers. But with that said, we also do track this at a north-south AMA level. So that accounts for some of the interconnectedness of our valley with the northern portion of this subbasin. And pumping in the southern portion then is more tied, kind of balanced with replenishment from the Pima Mine Road recharge project, which is closer to that area. So next slide. So just before I close out here, I want to mention that CAGRD is really looking closely at this issue and developing additional guidance around it. At our last committee meeting, the staff proposed an additional guiding principle for the CAGRD that tackles this directly. The guidance would direct staff, to the extent feasible, to complete groundwater replenishment activities in the subbasin where the obligation is incurred. So that's a lot better than AMA-wide or east-west, north-south in the case of Tucson. So we're really encouraged by that. So that's the analysis, and also shared some of the follow-on action that we're taking. I did go through a lot of material, but there's always more to discuss, so please, if there are any questions, let me know. But otherwise, thank you.
Thank you very much, Vivian, and also Krista and Jenna. Those were three very informative presentations. I appreciated getting to see the spatial representation. It gives a better understanding, I think, for all of us, and puts hydrologic disconnect gives us more information and data to work on as we look at hydrologic disconnect. I particularly appreciated the ADWR's maps that were showing the recent levels, or the pumping that are recent groundwater levels and such, so that we had a better understanding about of just seeing where there's areas that could be challenged in the future or not. And I think it helps us better understand as we look at hydrologic disconnect. Certainly there was a lot of information, and I am confident that Jenna, Krista, and Vivian would be glad to answer any questions that show up in the chat room, or anyone that would like to ask questions. And then also, in addition to, if you have questions, also wanted to just put out there, I know that it was brought up with Krista's presentation, that about how they're looking at long-term storage credits and how municipal providers would plan to recover, and assuming that they would be recovering in their service area, which I think is a good assumption. But still, any representatives from municipal providers, it'd be helpful to understand kind of your thoughts on operations and how you're looking at potential recovery in the future and such, and what issues you're concerned with that could be, that we should be aware of as we're looking at hydrologic disconnect. And when I say municipal providers, I'm meaning it according to statute, both public and private water providers. So, it looks like Chris had a statement that's Chris Brooks with CAP said recently the FICO GSF began taking deliveries of CAP water in the upper Santa Cruz Basin. This will expand the ability to conduct recharge in the southern portion of the Tucson Active Management Area. And CAGRD is actively seeking to conduct future replenishment activities at this GSF. So that is helpful additional information to have. Cynthia has a question, and Cynthia Campbell of Phoenix has a question, and then Wally Wilson with Metro Water District wants to comment on a few things regarding the Tucson Active Management Area. So Cynthia?
Sure. I just want to thank everyone who did a presentation. They were very thoughtful and put together very well. I actually have a couple of questions for Krista in her presentation. I'll start with the 78% number. I'm wondering, are you saying that the municipalities in the Phoenix AMA 78% of their long-term storage credits are within their service area, or that collectively, if you grouped us all together, 78% of our collective credits are somewhere within our collective service areas?
No, we looked at the water providers individually. So,
Okay.
So it's within each individual provider's service area. The one caveat to that is that because the on-project cities overlap with our service area and we have recovery agreements with many of you, we included our wells in that definition of service area. So Phoenix is a good example. We have wells within GRUSP or near GRUSP that can recover those credits and wheel them to you. So we considered Phoenix's GRUSP credits to be within their service area.
Okay. But I mean, that's really more based upon the fact that we have an agreement that was largely done in part to step around the challenges of the hydrologic disconnect, I suspect. But I guess my other question is I want to be sure I understand SRP's position there too, that goes with that, and that is that in many cities like Phoenix that have both on and off project areas vis-a-vis SRP, Phoenix can't recover anywhere in its service area the credits that it stores in the off-project areas of the city, not without paying SRP for that, correct?
Correct. Actually, it's not a matter of payment, it's a matter of exchange. You'd have to pay back with other water.
But the net effect is that we're basically giving our long-term storage credits that we're recovering to SRP because SRP considers that area to be their exclusive service area.
Yes.
So that's
but our analysis. So the analysis that I referred to, where we considered SRP's ability to recover, we limited that to the credits stored within SRP's boundaries.
I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So next, Wally has questions or comments, and I just want to again encourage everyone that's listening in today if you have any thoughts, ideas, suggestions of ideas for incentives or different ways that we can continue to narrow any hydrologic disconnect that is occurring and make sure that there's and help with that, then please be thinking about it so that we can discuss those and have your thoughts on it. Wally.
Thank you. Those are great presentations. Just a couple of refinements to some of the projects that are going on and have been going on in the Tucson AMA. Start off quickly with Tucson Water. I don't know if anybody from Tucson Water is there. I looked up and down the list and couldn't tell, but if you look at infrastructure and hydrogeology, Tucson Water probably only annually stores and recovers less than 10% of its total demand outside of hydrologic area of impact. So they've, the customers of Tucson Water have invested about $200 million in securing the renewable supply and having that water recovered and delivered as wet water management. The Northwest providers are in the middle of spending about $40 million to drill production wells within safe harbor of the recharge facilities in Marana. So the town of Marana, the town of Oro Valley, and Metro Water District are all partners in a long-term IGA to drill production wells, which have been drilled, and tie them together into a transmission main that will bring that wet water recovered within the area of impact into the service areas of each of the respective municipalities. So there's another effort here in Tucson AMA to break that hydrologic disconnect when it comes to annual storage and recovery. And so just wanted to bring that up, that their investment is continuing in the Tucson AMA to directly address hydrologic disconnect.
Thanks, Wally, for that additional information, and glad to hear that that project is moving forward. Terry Sue Rossi with Arizona Water Company. You would like to speak. Go ahead.
Thank you, Warren. I also appreciated the presentations that the three speakers gave. I appreciate them putting the time into putting those together. And the thought that I know a lot of thought goes into that. So I had a couple of things that I wanted to add to that. I thought also the discussion between Krista and Cynthia was very interesting. And what it kind of brought home for me is just how unique all of these situations really are. And we kind of, the curtain kind of pulled back for a moment there as we listened to them talk in a deeper level about a deeper level of how the two organizations could relate with one another relative to recovering long-term storage credits. And I personally found that to be true in my dealings as well, is that each situation is different. So there's not really a cookie cutter, this is how this works in all circumstances. And what situation might be perceived as being a hydrologic disconnect in one situation may not be in another. And once you've thought about it in a different way, you might discover that what you initially thought was disconnected is actually not. And so to me, an improvement in the system is actually to encourage this level of creativity, to not create a system that continues to kind of tighten things down and make things more restrictive, but one that encourages these kinds of creative solutions, because we've been doing this since 1997. We've been storing credits on the ground now since 1997. And I think the last thing that we should do is create a structure that would prohibit those credits from being recovered in the future, that would strand those credits. That would be, I think, a disservice to everybody who's ever stored those credits in the ground. So another improvement that I think I would say is more of an improvement, and this gets back to this assumption about that I think Krista made in her presentation, that water providers would recover the water inside of their service area. As things have become stricter, as the regulatory structure has become stricter, it's becoming increasingly more difficult to, in fact, do that. And so if we are going to go in that direction, then I think we have to be open to the idea that recovery can occur outside of a water provider's service area. So if you tell people, yeah, store all this water, then they can't recover from it within their service area, and then you say they can't recover from anywhere but within their service area, then we've created an intolerable situation. We've created a situation where it's not possible to accomplish the objective. So to me, those are things that would look like improvements. And then I also wanted to ask Jenna, if there was any information that she could provide on something that I would consider to be the actual area of hydrologic impact, and talk, not today, obviously, but maybe at a future meeting, she could talk about how the actual area of hydrologic impact is determined and how does that work relative to recovery well permits and the dynamic aspects of recharge plumes and the area of hydrologic impact and how that all works. So those are my comments, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry Sue. Sandy, you had a comment?
Yes, thanks, Warren, and thanks everybody for your presentation. I think it was very informative and helpful to sort of visualize the work that's been done. Really, I mean, I look at this as a success. All the recharge that has occurred, you know, and highlighting the hydrologic disconnect is something that this isn't something new. You know, it was something that was understood to some degree when the program went into effect, but thank you for the presentations. As to Krista, the specific slide on what the unknown hydrologic disconnect for some of the entities who've stored in the Phoenix AMA, obviously Freeport was identified on there. And I'm certain that Krista is aware of the exchange agreement that we have with Salt River Project. I'm not sure how many folks know what Freeport has done historically, but we have an agreement where we deliver water to Salt River Project from a tribal lease that we have. And in that agreement, we quote unquote exchange that CAP water upstream from Roosevelt off the Black River for water that's delivered directly to our Morenci operation. So that's why sometimes people see Morenci's on CAP water. It sort of throws them a bit, but it's through an existing exchange that occurs. And the storage that we're doing is essentially resilience for times of shortage when that CAP water may not be available, where we would be able to have SRP or others recover those credits in exchange for Salt River water coming down the system. So I don't think it's an unknown. I think it's just an example of ways that we've been managing these sources for a very long time, and also building into the process or using the recharge and recovery program and the exchange program as a mechanism to build resiliency into our systems. So thanks.
Thank you, Sandy. And Terry Sue just commented that Sandy described another example of a creative solution. Kathy Ferris, you have a question. You have a couple of questions, it looks like. So I'm going to let you. Would you like to speak up with that, or would you like me just to read this?
Sure. I'll just end up reading it myself, Warren.
Yes, please, please.
Okay, I'll take it off your plate. So my question was that and I think you alluded to this, Krista, that the most expensive potential solution that you shared with us was CAP wheeling and then having to drill new wells. But it would seem that wheeling in general would add cost to recovery of these credits. And so I wanted to know if you've looked at how municipal water providers would be, quote, encouraged, end quote, to enter into these more expensive options. In other words, does there need to be some statutory way to make this happen?
Sure. I think it's a great question. So the way I see it, and someone from DWR or from the city is welcome to join in and correct me if I've got this wrong, but is that if you recover credits outside the area of impact and you're a designated provider, which the vast majority of those credits in the municipal category are held by designated providers, that recovery, that pumping does not count towards your physical availability. You have to prove independently that the water is physically available. And in the most recent redesignation process, that was a tight process. There wasn't enough groundwater to go around in that redesignation process. So I don't know how successful a water provider would be in adding those credits to their designation unless they were recovered from within the area of impact. To the extent they were able to do that, they're also limited by the 4-foot decline requirement. So if they were pumping in an area that is experiencing those decline rates, they couldn't get a recovery well permit. So I think that those existing requirements will be the impetus for recovery in the area of the water restored, even if that requires wheeling.
Okay. So my other question has to do with the fact that we're kind of assuming that it's always good to recover within the area of impact to a certain extent. And I get that that's what hydrologic disconnect is all about, but we've also know that there are areas where groundwater levels are declining, and maybe we ought to be trying to encourage recovery sometimes in those areas rather than in the area of impact. I wondered if you looked at that question or that issue.
No, we did not.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Krista. Eric Brown with the town of Gilbert, you have some thoughts to share?
I've got kind of two general thoughts here. The first is that it seems to me that clearly there's some sort of subconscious recognition that recharge and recovery or pumping and replenishment that's physically disconnected isn't a sustainable practice or a wise practice. And I come to that conclusion because we've got a bunch of statements from entities that they have made guidance policies to try and avoid that kind of practice. So the CAGRD with their board policies and some of their active negotiations that they're working on, as well as grows. So if we have that subconscious understanding, it kind of begs the question, do we want to keep relying on the goodwill of individual providers to solve this problem on their own? Or do we want to develop larger level policies that require an end to this kind of practice? And that's kind of my first thought is, do we want to just keep doing this on our own, cobbling it together and saying it'll be all right? Or do we want the state to step in and help us with a carrot in order to change these practices? My second thought is that there's a few barriers in place that I think it would be a good start for us to kind of remove in order to allow some of these creative solutions. So, for example, Krista put out one of those solutions out there, and it involved Gilbert, and it's one we've looked at, and there's a policy that prevents that specific exchange from happening, and it's the water bud statute. Town of Queen Creek can't take any credits from years past because of the water bud statute. So that's a problem that's preventing us from working together. Another issue is that potentially people could trade wet water for credits. And there's another policy that prevents that from happening with CAP subcontracts. And then there's other issues of what I would kind of consider quote unquote stranded water that's stored out at Tonopah Desert. And I'd call it stranded because there's no real recovery plan for that water. And I'm going to kind of say tongue in cheek, is there a way that we could use something that maybe we could creatively call a water bank to exchange credits, exchange water supplies, and help work on these type of recovery issues? I think that those are kind of, if I was going to say, those are my first few ideas for how to solve some of these problems. I'm sure that there are a lot of others, but those are a first crack at starting a list of things that, solutions that we could work on.
So Eric, just a little clarification with your first question that you posed of relying on our own goodwill and creativity, or could there be some encouragement from the state? You mentioned like help with the carrot. Were those then those items that you just listed ideas that you would put in the carrot category or in the area of ideas, or did you have any other idea when you said carrots? Were there any other thoughts that you had?
Maybe that was also tongue in cheek. I think other people would maybe call it a stick, but I think that if in future management plans or whatever that looks like in the future, which we're also going to creatively come up with in this subcommittee, hopefully, that says that we have to put an end to this kind of practice of storing water in a place where it is unrecoverable to the entity. I think that could be something that could be put into a management plan.
Okay. Well, thank you for the different ideas that you listed there. And Brett Fleck with the City of Peoria, you have a comment.
Yeah, thank you, Warren. I have a number of comments kind of stretching the gamut from recharge replenishment to recovery pumping, kind of just lumping those together, recognizing that they're different. Building off of what Eric was getting at with trying to come up with some solutions or identifying tangible things we can work on. One of them has to do with recharge facility permitting. And I think for some folks who have tried to get new facilities permitted or increase capacity at certain facilities, they've run into some issues with modeling, and the modeling seems to put out results that don't comport well with reality, with impacts that stretch tens of miles. And what I'm getting at here is there's a standard of unreasonable harm in permitting recharge facilities, and I might argue that from a high level, we might be creating unreasonable harm by preventing strategic recharge. So I'll throw that out there. Another reason that recharging locally is so hard is because geology rarely aligns with where there's undeveloped, low-cost land. And I think everyone has seen that over the last 20 or 30 years with the explosive development, some of the best recharge areas from a geologic standpoint have been paved over. Talking about that, I would also look forward into the future and say the Phoenix area is planning on having millions of more people and paving over an awful lot more land. And perhaps it would be beneficial for the owner of much of that land, the Arizona State Land Department, to work with the Department of Water Resources on identifying and perhaps setting aside lands that are best used for recharge ahead of time to avoid the problem we've created through paving over the best areas of recharge for the last 20 or 30 years. So that's on the recharge replenishment side. On the recovery pumping side, just adding to what Eric, I think, might have been getting at is perhaps it would make sense to exchange credits and pool long-term Arizona Water Banking Authority credits at Tonopah Desert Recharge Project, and then authorizing the use of the water storage tax for infrastructure out at Tonopah to recover the water that the tax was used to store, kind of closing the loop and maybe making that more efficient. Another thing, going to the area of hydrologic impact, the 1 mile radius rule, I think a lot of folks recognize that that's arbitrary and not based in reality, but also recognize that something was needed. So that's what it was. And an example that I would put to counter that I often invoke is for the Vistancia community. The city of Peoria has 10 wells that are between 1.07 and 1.81 miles from the Agua Fria recharge project. And despite pumping nearly 4,000 acre feet a year for the last decade or more, the water levels in those wells have largely risen. And that's simply due to the storage that's occurring at Agua Fria recharge project. So to suggest that those are not hydrologically connected just doesn't make sense to me, but I understand why the rules exist. At the same time, we have wells that are 4 to 5 miles from our recharge projects, and I'm not suggesting that those should be connected. However, recharge permitting modeling would suggest they're connected. So we're kind of working at opposite ends where we're being maybe a bit too conservative on recovery permitting and maybe a bit too conservative on recharge permitting, and they are working at cross purposes. To go back to something that was brought up a few years ago with enhanced aquifer management, sustainable aquifer planning. One of the things that I think that this state has run into in my brief time in water is that perfect is often the enemy of good, particularly with addressing this hydrologic impact, and kind of getting at what the CAGRD's proposed internal policy of replenishing within the subbasin. And there's been a lot of talk about whether that's good or bad or good enough. And boy, I think that would be a great place to start, is requiring recovery or replenishment within the subbasin. I think that's a really nice way to inch us forward. Another thing that I think would be important is that after watching Jenna's presentation, which by the way, I forgot to mention, these 3 presentations were some of the best I've ever seen, and I've learned an amazing amount in the last hour and a half. So kudos to the 3 presenters. But going back to Jenna's point, before I stop yapping here, is that I think there's an awful lot of annual storage and recovery going on. In fact, Peoria does ASR for 30 to 40% of its water supply, and maybe it wouldn't be so bad if there was a cut to the aquifer to incentivize or increase the incentive to invest in direct delivery of surface water supplies. So there's that. And then my last comment is I'd like to positively recognize ADWR's updated policy statement on seeking a variance to the area of hydrologic impact. I think it's fantastic that the department has recognized that that's an area that needs work and has opened the book on that, so to speak, by putting out a new policy. I do think that policy needs some work. For example, it seems to discount the collective impact of storage by focusing on only the long-term storage credits that a provider has a particular facility. And it, in doing so, parses out water, an individual user's contribution to recharging, unlike how water credits that are delivered in a system are commingled and cannot be separated. So that's something that I would look at. So I'll stop talking now, but I really appreciate all your time. I just had a list of notes that I wanted to talk about, and I'll thank the 81 plus people that are on this call for listening to me ramble. Thank you.
No, thank you, Brett. That was exactly what we're wanting to hear, is different ideas. We certainly want to hear thoughts about some of the ideas that you put forward, as well as Eric, and including the ones that Krista mentioned. So this is the kind of discussion dialogue that we very much encourage and welcome. Just to note real quick in the chat room, Jenna noted that, Kathy, my hope was that the maps I created would help identify those areas that may benefit from recharge and areas that may be more hydrologically equipped to support pumping, i.e. recovery. And Kathy said, thanks for pointing that out. And then Wally Wilson just noted with Brett that in the Tucson active management area, there are exhausted gravel pits that impede expansion of recharge facilities due to unreasonable harm. So clearly there's opportunities for improvements in a lot of areas. So additional thoughts, ideas, comments, feedback, concerns, questions?
Hey, Warren, Jake Lunderking here.
Hi, Jake.
Hey, I too wanted to applaud the 3 presentations. I did learn a lot as well, and I've really enjoyed this meeting. I think the dialogue's been really rich, and I want to applaud that as well. I don't have a lot to add to it other than maybe just zooming out away from recharge and recovery and the area of impact, but maybe the bigger pictures that are out there. You know, drought on the Colorado River and uncertainty would lead me to say storage and recovery is a very important long-term tool. Now, building only surface water treatment plants could cause a much more severe problem, and an acute problem at that, where you could actually not have water to tap. A declining aquifer gives us time to respond over years or decades, and that's why I really enjoy this conversation, is because we're responding to what we see. The other big picture is, I think a lot of the declines in the aquifer and the cones of depression we saw in the early maps didn't have a lot of recovery wells in them. Some did, some didn't. But we have to keep in mind that those other groundwater pumping uses are actually a big source of the groundwater decline. So if we're trying to manage groundwater declines, of course we gotta think strategically on that other leg there, which is hard to do. But I do think we could do more on recharge, and that it just following up on Brett's comment. If there's more we can do to making that process a little bit easier, I think we would see more recharge facilities closer to the area of pumping. Thanks, Warren. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Jake.
Warren, I have a question, probably for Jenna. I'm wondering if you looked at being able to take the annual storage and recovery and drill down a little bit more into the area of impact and where it's being pumped from.
I did not parse out, I just did the water delivered. Yeah, no, I didn't parse that down. Spatially, you mean, like on a map to show?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if that's something we could work with or work on as like a follow-up to, because the amount of annual storage and recovery is a big enough number. We should, I think, as a follow-up to this discussion, talk about a way that we could work together to nail that down.
Yeah, I think one thing that would need to be considered is that if you were, I guess when I think about it, I think so we could show where water has been sent and then which wells recovered that water. Of course, that would just be a real snapshot in time, because at any given point they might report recovering that water annually out of one well and then the following year out of another well. Yeah. So that is why I did just include all of the permitted wells, because theoretically that are all of the places that water could be recovered. And by showing all of the delivered water, that's all of the places that annual that annual storage could happen. So that was kind of my thought process, but I will think more about that, Krista, and think if there is a way we could look at that.
Yeah, I can see where with the annual, it's hard to do more than a snapshot approach, but yeah, I want to echo everybody else's comments. I think your maps were really helpful and bring a lot of insight to this discussion. So thanks, Jenna, for putting it together.
Thank you.
Patrick Adams with AMWA, you have a question, and I'm not sure who you want to pose that to, or if it's just to everyone. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Warren. I think Krista and I asked the same question at the same time. So my question was, of the 2.7 million acre foot of recovery that's taken place on an annual basis, do we know where that's happening within proximity to where it was stored? So maybe going along with Brett Fleck suggested the subbasin as a starting point. One starting point might be how much annual storage and recovery has taken place in different subbasins, but it sounds like we're going to work on that. Sorry for the duplicate.
Oh, thank you. And Brett, you have another comment?
Yeah, just I saw it from the chat. I think Kathy might have had a question for Jenna. I didn't want to jump ahead of her.
Oh, thank you for pointing that out.
You can jump away, Brett, but
go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. Defer to your elders, okay? I wanted to clarify something that I thought I heard Jenna say at the beginning of her presentation. And I thought, Jenna, that you said that the potential for hydrologic disconnect is great if we have a situation where a lot of the credits are recovered at the same time. Is that correct?
Yeah, I did say something to that effect, Kathy. When I was presenting on the dashboard, I just tried to make the point that a lot more water has been delivered and left in storage than has been recovered up until this point. And so that kind of yellow line on the dashboard, if anybody goes and looks at it, represents that amount of water will be recovered at some point, and it's a large amount, and so depending on where that water is recovered, you could see a lot more impacts from hydrologic disconnect than we have currently seen. And I don't, I acknowledge that I know that that's a point that's been made, but I think that showing it in a dashboard format connected with the maps is helpful.
Well, thank you. That's a great clarification. I think that's really excellent. So I appreciate that. I just wanted to make sure I understood that correctly. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy and Jenna. Brett, your comment?
Yeah, thanks. One thing that I wanted to bring up, and I alluded to it in my chat here, is that has to do with groundwater allowance for utilities, and particularly the groundwater allowance that is calculated annually, which is, for those out there that may not know, is 4% of your water use on an annual basis is considered to be sustainable groundwater through incidental recharge of using water in your utility or in your service area, excuse me. The thing that I wanted to bring up is that groundwater allowance, at least that what's calculated annually, has very, very similar characteristics and principles as long-term storage credits or recharge for that matter, but it's treated very differently from an assured water supply perspective and from the area of hydrologic impact. And that's something that I just like to bring up as something that maybe we talk about and how that plays into the hydrologic disconnect, because utilities have very different approaches to whether they use long-term storage credits to offset pumping or whether they use groundwater allowance to offset pumping. And even though they're both considered sustainable practices with a renewable water source, they have very different outcomes when it comes to assured water supply and area of hydrologic impact. So that's just something that I wanted to put on the table for perhaps a future discussion. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Any other comments or feedback, ideas at this time?
Warren, I have one more comment.
Sure, Kathy.
And this is really about K-Grid. And I think it'd be wonderful if there is a policy or a law to require replenishment in the same subbasin as where the excess groundwater is pumped. But I'm wondering if that is even really a close enough connection in some cases. So these subbasins are very big. And I know that it is not K-Grid's responsibility to replenish the groundwater that's pumped by its members where its members pump it. But I would ask us to think about that moving forward, because if that replenishment doesn't occur where the groundwater is pumped, and if it's not in a close enough correlation, then at some point the groundwater that is being pumped by the members will run out. And it is a big concern of mine. And it isn't a concern now because we don't have as much replenishment obligation as we will have in the future. And in the future, in some of these areas, it could be extremely large, and we could be seeing a lot of groundwater depletion that isn't really replenished or affected by the replenishment obligation. Thank you.
Okay, Kathy. Thank you, Kathy. Laura, I see you there. Did you want to give any comment?
Well, I appreciate Kathy's comment, and I think that's been a long-standing desire by some to have replenishment occur in the exact location. I think that realistically, I think we've all heard there are a number of obstacles sometimes to building recharge facilities. So I think it's just not, in my mind, necessarily feasible to consider replenishment in the exact area of pumping. So I guess that's one comment. The other comment is these member lands are being provided water by a service, a water provider. And so, making sure, I'm not sure that hopefully these water providers won't run out of water. They are regulated. And if that's a concern, those are things that I think regionally that's maybe an issue we should look at, as opposed to requiring a replenishment in the same area as a pumping. Is it the security of certain water providers serving their members? I mean, everyone is getting an assured supply through a certificate or a designation. So if that's a concern that water providers will run out of water, I think that's a separate issue than just replenishment.
Well, lots of food for thought. Again, three really solid presentations. Very much appreciate, again, the efforts of ADWR, SRP, and CAP of putting together those presentations and working on that, and particularly appreciate Jenna, Krista, and Vivian for presenting them today. And just want to thank everyone who had questions and had comments and suggestions. They are all duly noted, and we're keeping track of all of that. I think, one thought that I have had, and Jake Lenderking alluded to this, is there's a lot going on right now in our water world. Certainly, a lot of our attention is to the west of here, looking out at the Colorado River, and west and north, I guess I should say, particularly northward of hoping for improved hydrology this winter. But I think that it's really important that we're having this conversation in the post-2025 committee, where we're looking at what issues that we have in the AMAs, and how can we best address those issues so that they are not challenges or don't become larger problems beyond 2025. It's very important that we're taking care of all of our water resources at this time, not just, again, with all the attention on the Colorado River, we shouldn't lose sight of making sure that we're doing all that we can to protect the management of our groundwater here. I noticed that Michael Curtis, that you had I'm not sure if this is if you have a comment in addition to what you wrote here, where you said some members of the Pinal AMA is fascinated by Kathy Ferris's comments. Any additional comments you wanted to make, Michael?
No, we're just fascinated, as always, since 1980.
Okay. Well, water definitely is fascinating, and it's certainly super important for all of us. And so I appreciate knowing that there are so many folks that are here today, and also outside of this participating today, that are working to make sure that as a state we can continue to have the water that we need to be able to continue to thrive. We have tentatively planned a meeting for October 5th for the committee. We will send out a confirmation to confirm whether to make sure that's a firm date. What Cheryl and I are hoping to do is are not hoping, we are planning to put together, to be reviewing the various ideas, comments that have been received, so that we can then talk about next time that we get together on, well, what are some areas that seem to, that we could work on in the next few months to see if we can put together some ideas of how we could then advance some solutions that are agreed upon or that there's general consensus about. We know that, as I mentioned earlier, we know that is going to be a tall challenge, but we're certain that this committee is up to that. And also, again, that we recognize that we've also have next year to continue to work on solutions and strategies for these issues. But we're really hopeful that we could maybe put together some that we can present in December to the Governor's Water Council and then get direction from them on how best to move forward. So again, thank you to all of you, and appreciate your time this afternoon, and hope that all of you will continue to get through this what feels like a very long week, even though it's been relatively short with Labor Day, and hope that you have a good rest of the week. So thank you.